every communist society has ended up being a totalitarian terror state. Why? What is the process? What is the development? What takes people from an ideal of equality, brotherhood, fraternity to terror? What is the process? Why does it happen?
Well, I think one is the direct consequence of the other. The creation of artificial equality between people who are naturally unequal. Naturally, I mean, there is a natural distribution of skills, talents, intelligence, work ethic, diligence, etc. In order to equalize this unequal reality, you have to exert an awful lot of force, because people who are talented and hardworking and capable do not want to be equalized, so to speak. And in order to create that society, you have to use a lot of force, because what you're doing is extremely unnatural, and forcing productive people to give away almost everything they create while they observe in their very workplace other people who are not trying, who are not working hard, who are not as talented, who are not as capable as them, effectively be paid the same and treated the same. That creating that reality requires a hell of a lot of force. Now, look, I think another thing that ought to be acknowledged is it's not just about communism. I mean, in the 30s, what Stalin was doing was also dealing with revolutionaries, right? Once you've had a revolution, the revolutionaries become not only not useful, but they become a problem, because you've got these people who are, deeply enthusiastic about tearing things down and don't really know how to build anything. And so if you are trying to build anything, no matter how bad it is, you have to get rid of them. And I think that's part of the reason. But I think your point more broadly about the tendency towards totalitarianism is based on the fact that the society you're attempting to create is incredibly incompatible with human nature. And simply does not work at that sort of scale. Communism is probably great at the level of the individual family. Like my family is a communist society, if you like, right? In that, for the three people that exist in it, right? They all have very different roles, but they all share it in that, and maybe at the level of a small tribe like that, I think is it called a Dunbar number, like 150 tribal people, you might be able to do something like that. I think once you start to get beyond familial ties, having this idea that we must all we must put our neighbor before our children, so I don't think that's ever going to work. And if you're trying to force people to do that, you're going to very quickly find yourself having to use a hell of a lot of force.
I suppose if you go back to the collectivization of farms, which Lenin and most communist societies thereafter tried to copy, causing famines in many countries, in Russia, in China, in Vietnam, and Cuba, all sorts of places, North Korea. All these places have had famines. People have starved to death. And what you're doing when you collectivize a farm is you're going to one farmer and saying, sorry, that all that stuff you've built up over years, or perhaps your parents or grandparents helped build up, your farm, your animals, your crops that you've planted with care and love, you've got to give those all to a collective farm. So give it over now, and do it voluntarily, by the way.
And your labor too.
And your labor.
You have to give your labor in, and then you get a small amount back that the government decides.
And there will be people who due to some aspect of human nature which we may like or not like, but we are human and we have our human nature, and part of that is to say, I made this, I ought to be allowed to keep it. And so then you have the conflict which you describe, and you have the revolts that took place all over the place, certainly in Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. The major revolts took place, which had to be put down with armed forces. And that, I think you're right to identify that as the moment when it goes from being an ideal to being a terror state.
That's right. And I think there's another aspect, I think, James, that's probably worth mentioning. And I've been thinking about this a lot, because one of the big, I think, philosophical discussions and political discussions in this area is about the role of hierarchy. And in a healthy society, I think we've had a lot of kind of postmodernism in recent decades, in which sort of abhors hierarchy as a whole and is very keen on, upending it or ending or creating a world with no hierarchy, which is what communism to some extent pretended to do as well. The problem is that I think hierarchy is an inevitable consequence of that bell curve distribution of talents and skills and everything I was talking about. And in a healthy society, hierarchy is based on merit. That's not to say that this perfect society exists exactly, because human nature and corruption and so on. But generally speaking, the idea is that, there's a hierarchy of regard, you might say, which is based on public perception of contribution. In other words, I remember, for example, in my little town where I live, I used to play basketball in the local court in the park. And, I was just one of the guys and nobody particularly cared who I was or anything. And then I started to organize an annual basketball tournament for all the kids who played there. And suddenly I noticed that everyone started treating me differently, right? Why was that? Well, they felt that I was doing something for others that was contributing to the entire ecosystem there, right? So in a healthy society, the more you help or the more you do for others, the higher your regard. And ideally, you get to a position where the people who are contributing the most are regarded the most. And that's what we mean by hierarchy. Now, what happens in a communist society is you deliberately create a perverse hierarchy. In other words, the people who are the most corrupt, the most willing to lie, the most willing to dob their neighbor into the authorities, the most willing to cheat, the most willing to steal, they become the ones in charge. They are the ones on top of the hierarchy. And the decent, honest, hardworking person becomes the bottom of the hierarchy. And the inevitable product of that is that society becomes less productive. It becomes less constructive in the way that it does things. And one of the reasons, I think, for the economic underperformance, if we put it diplomatically, of communist societies is that it creates a false hierarchy and with perverse incentives, where the cream sits at the bottom and quite often is eliminated, literally eliminated, and all of the, I won't say what, rises to the top and governs everything.
Yeah, and one aspect of hierarchy that existed in the Soviet Union was although wages were more similar, in theory at least, in practice the officials had special shops where they could get things which ordinary people couldn't get. Is that not right?
Well, yes, it was actually a very brief period in my family's time when we lived after the Soviet Union collapsed, so it wasn't nearly what it was, in the former dacha of a former member of the Politburo for like a year. And we discovered, to my surprise, that there were these special, I think they were called spецраспределители, special distribution shops where you'd get special food. The party bosses could have access to Western movies, which were not available to anyone. Pornography, of course, inevitably, and so on. They had all access to all these evil products of Western capitalism that they enjoyed in the privacy of their government dachas. So yes, the idea that everyone was equal and all of this stuff, as we see around the world in all these places where you have these populist kind of revolutionary people who say that we must create equality between people. They all live in palaces, inevitably. And that's because there's something probably quite natural in some ways about a hierarchy in which, like there are countries in which you couldn't be the leader of a country unless you live in a palace because no one would respect you. Do you know what I mean? And I think there's something pretty normal about that there is a kind of, the people in different roles in society are accorded different incomes and all of this stuff. It's the natural way that this thing works. Right? I'm not saying it's good or bad or whatever. It just seems to be that in a society in which you have people rewarded for merit, ideally, I'm saying ideally because it doesn't always work that way, then that will happen, right, over time. I'm not sure that that's necessarily universally a good thing, but is it better than everything else that's available? Probably it is.
You've referred to human nature being against communism in one sense.
Yeah.
Is there another sense in which human nature is against communism in the desire for freedom? You were not allowed, people in the Soviet Union were not allowed to travel abroad freely. They were not allowed to say what they wanted. And is there a natural impulse, at least it may vary from one human being to another, but some human beings at least have an urge to be free to do what they want.
I think that's a very important nuance that you introduced into this, because it's a big debate, as I'm sure you're aware, in the current political environment and culturally and philosophically, about whether, whether freedom is this unbridled good. I think many people don't perceive it as being that, particularly when, safety, prosperity, etc., are not on the table. So people who are poor and starving, they don't really care as much about freedom as they care about solving those problems first. And I think there are some people who actually crave a certain conformity and someone to tell them what to do, and tell them what to think and not have to worry too much. However, I think the point that you make is absolutely right, which is there is a quite big group of people for whom the freedom to make their own decisions about things is really quite, not just quite important. There is, I think, a group of people for whom it is a non-negotiable. And those people suffer the most, of course, in these sort of societies. Now, what the psychological underpinnings are there, I imagine that there's some element of, it's a more appealing worldview for people who feel a sense of agency of their own lives, for people who want to be free to fail or succeed on their merit because they suspect that they will likely succeed. I suspect that there are some people whose posture towards the world is the opposite of that, for whom a more controlled environment is much more appealing because they're going to be looked after. And this is one of the criticisms that I have, I think, for us in Europe, actually. The difference, I think, between Europe and America is that many, but this is one of them, which is in Europe, we don't really want to be unleashed to do the things that we want to do, which is the attitude mostly in America that I see. We just want to be looked after more than anything. And I think it's that tension that communism caters to. It says, you have to worry, you're definitely not going to fail, because no matter how bad you are at your job, no matter how lazy you are, no matter what you do, you're going to be fine. I don't want to live in that society, but I think there are quite a lot of people who objectively who do want to live in that society. And I think that's probably one of the reasons that this idea of people invent different names for it, because communism kind of has a bad rep, well earned, I think. We keep coming round and round to this idea over and over. And you look around in the modern world, there are people who want to send people that message, who are becoming very popular on social media nowadays.